Picture this: a free man in the year 850 walks up to a lord's estate and asks to be a serf, not captured, not conquered, not forced into a corner at sword point. He walks up and asks. That sentence should sound insane. Everything you've ever been taught about feudalism says serfdom was a cage. Peasants born into bondage, trapped under a boot with no say in the matter at all. Now here's the problem. The historical record doesn't back that up. Not for how the system actually started. In this video, I'm breaking this down into 4 parts. First, what the world actually looked like before feudalism and why it was so terrifying that people went looking for a cage. Second, what serfs got in this deal and why historians increasingly call it insurance and not slavery. Third, the exact moment the deal stopped being fair and serfdom curdled into the oppressive system we picture today. And the fourth, why we still get the story backwards 700 years later. Now let's start with the world before the deal. Rewind to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 400s and 500s. And I mean collapse. No more legions patrolling the roads. No more centralized courts. No more empire-wide currency. No more anyone guaranteeing that the harvest you grew this year would still be yours by winter. What replaces it across huge parts of Western Europe is basically nothing. A power vacuum. And into that vacuum was exactly what you'd expect. Roaming war bands, opportunistic raiders, rival warlords fighting over scraps of collapsed Roman infrastructure. If you are an independent farmer in Gaul or Italy in the year 600, you own your land technically. Legally on paper it's yours, but paper doesn't stop a raiding party. Paper doesn't build a wall. Paper doesn't put an armed man on a horse to defend your grain stores when 6 armed men on horses show up wanting them. You are, in the most literal sense, on your own. And on your own, in the early medieval world, usually means dead, starving, or enslaved by someone worse than a lord. Now here's where it gets interesting. In this landscape, local strongmen, men with horses, weapons, and the ability to organize defense, start offering something nobody else can: protection. Not government, not law in the modern sense, just protection, backed by force from a specific patch of land. And free farmers start taking the deal in huge numbers. What was actually in it for them? The arrangement formalized over the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries roughly works like this. The farmer gives up full legal freedom and a share of what they produce, usually somewhere between a third and a half, depending on the region and the century. In exchange, they get military protection, access to the lord's mill, oven, and press. Then that's infrastructure they couldn't build alone, a guaranteed right to work a specific plot, generation after generation, and critically, a legal identity inside a system that at least claimed to have rules, instead of zero protection in a world that had none. Now the last point matters more than it sounds. A serf couldn't be evicted on a whim in most functioning manorial systems. Custom and precedent protected their tenancy in ways that pure lawlessness never could. Historians studying manorial court records have found peasants suing lords, and sometimes winning, over customary rights to land, grazing, and inheritance. That is not the behavior of a system with zero leverage on the peasant's side. Compare the alternative. In the collapsed world of the 600s and 700s, an independent farmer has full legal freedom and roughly zero actual security. Under the manorial system that follows, a serf has restricted legal freedom and dramatically more actual security. If you're choosing between technically free and dead or bound and fed, that's not really a hard call. It's the same logic behind every insurance product ever sold. Give up some autonomy now in exchange for someone else absorbing catastrophic risk later. That's why historian Mark, one of the most influential scholars of medieval Europe, described early feudal bonds less as domination and more as a web of mutual, if wildly unequal obligation. The lord owed the serf protection and access to the land. The serf owed the lord labor and loyalty. Both sides could, in theory, be held to it. So part 3, if it started as something closer to a contract, when did it become the nightmare we picture now? The turn happens gradually, mostly across the 11th through the 13th century. And it happens for a boring but brutal reason. The lord's side of the bargain stopped being necessary to enforce. As centralized kingdoms slowly rebuilt, stronger monarchies, standing armies, more consistent law courts, the original justification for serfdom quietly evaporates. Farmers no longer desperately need a local strongman's private army, because larger states are increasingly providing basic order themselves. But the obligations don't evaporate along with it. The labor dues stay. The restrictions on movement stay. The share of the harvest owed to the lord stays. It was originally a trade for protection against total chaos, slowly calcifies into raw extraction, because lords have zero incentive to voluntarily give up free labor once the reason for the deal is gone. By the late medieval period, serfdom has drifted almost completely from its original logic. It's no longer insurance against a lawless world. It's simply hereditary extracted labor maintained by custom, law, and force, long after the actual danger that justified it in the first place had faded. This is also roughly when peasant revolts start becoming a defining feature of European history. For example, the 1381 Peasants' Revolt in England, the French Jacquerie of 1358, because at this point populations understand correctly that the original bargain is dead, but the obligation from it never left. So part 4, why do we still get this story backwards? Simply because the version of feudalism that survives in popular memory is the late version, the extractive, calcified, obviously oppressive version, right before the system finally collapsed under plague, revolt, and the rise of wage labor in the 13 and 1400s. That's the feudalism in your textbook illustrations. Miserable serfs, cruel lords, a system with no internal logic at all beyond raw domination. But that snapshot skips the first 3 or 4 centuries entirely. The part where the deal, however unequal, was actually addressing a real and terrifying problem, and functioned for a while, roughly the way it was supposed to. None of this makes serfdom good. Even at its most functional, it was still a wildly unequal trade, and the fact that it curdled into pure extraction the moment the leverage shifted tells you almost everything about how these systems actually work. But that's exactly the point. Feudalism didn't start because people were forced into chains. It started because people voluntarily built a cage around themselves, because the world outside the cage was even much worse. And the real story isn't that the lords were monsters from day one. It's that any system built on protection in exchange for freedom only stays fair as long as the protection is actually needed. The moment it isn't, the cage stays locked away. That's not a medieval problem. That's a pattern. And once you know how to look for it, you'll start noticing it everywhere. Thank you and good night.